Hey there, everyone, and welcome back once again. In this little video, I'm going to wrap up chapter 37 on the 1970s with a quick look at the Ford and Carter years, the Ford and Carter administrations. And we'll look at both of these administrations in not near as much detail as we have some of their predecessors. Both of these administrations are relatively short. Ford only is finishing President Nixon's term after his resignation in 1974, and then Carter only served one term from 1976 until 1980 when he is defeated by Ronald Reagan. So that should tell you, particularly about Carter, that and Ford both, that these were presidents that really struggled to kind of find some success in a lot of things, that struggled to kind of get public opinion on their side about a lot of things, and that they were both, particularly Carter, quite unpopular by the end of their terms, and both end up being defeated and don't receive a second term. So let's talk about some of the big things that were happening in both of these administrations. Now, mention Gerald Ford, President Gerald Ford, a little bit at the end of the previous section, and we talked about how he was actually the only non-elected president, and that he was never elected to the executive branch in any way, because he had been the Speaker of the House under the Nixon administration, or not as part of the Nixon administration, but while the Nixon administration was in office. And then when Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to resign over a bribery scandal, Ford stepped into the vice president position. And then when Nixon resigns, Ford finds himself as the president. So Gerald Ford inherits, a lot of the problems. We've talked already about how he inherited the disgrace, of the government being disgraced, their party being disgraced over the Watergate scandal, and had the very difficult, if not somewhat impossible, job of trying to restore credibility and to restore faith in the government and try to prove honesty in the government and those kind of things, which was difficult to do anyway. But also because of his pardoning of Nixon, that really tarnished that ability to do that. Although Ford was a common assessment of him is that he was a very, very nice, very decent, very honest person that wanted to do well, but was just ill-equipped, was just in over his head to deal with a lot of things, and inherit a lot of problems that he just wasn't able to fix, and maybe just wasn't fully prepared for the kind of task he was going to have to do, although he had a lot of things stacked up against him as well. So the big problems that are going to plague both the Ford and Carter administrations continue to be economic problems, the same things that we saw under Nixon, and that is extremely high inflation, prices going up, including gas prices with the oil embargo, and all of that, but just basic prices for regular things, for groceries, and people are seeing their paychecks go less and less, and buy less things at the grocery store, and so people are struggling and having to cut back on a lot of things, and just an overall economic recession. And remember that the United States had been in a period of economic growth and expansion for decades, and so the fact that the United States' economy was stalling, and that there was high unemployment, and that businesses were having to close and things were shutting down, that was not only bad for people's wallets and people's bank accounts, but it was also just distressing to the country's morale. A lot of people are starting to question, if the United States has been so dominant and so healthy and so successful and so powerful, and a lot of people are starting to question that. What is our place in the world? Given all of these problems, President Ford's reaction and his attempt to try to fix the inflation problem was through a campaign, a very lackluster and not very well promoted public campaign called WIN, and WIN stood for Whip Inflation Now. So Ford, being more conservative, and because of that growing conservative wing and conservative conscience of the Republican Party, wanting less government involvement, less government intervention, less government solutions to problems, he didn't want to do any kind of direct intervention or any kind of big, bold actions to try to combat the inflation problem. So Whip Inflation Now is basically just a public relations campaign, just to try to get people to voluntarily do what they could to halt inflation, mainly to stop spending. When inflation now is really just a campaign to encourage people stop spending so much, save, don't buy things, in the hopes that that would keep prices from rising. And they had little pins like this one, for people to wear on their clothes, on their jacket, to say that they were supporting it. And it really ends up being almost kind of a joke. For one thing, it didn't really work, and a lot of people chose not to do it, and it became, like I said, kind of a symbol of Ford's ineffectiveness to deal with the inflation problem. So inflation continues, unemployment continues, the economy continues to shrink, and led that inability to deal with all those problems led to Ford not having, a huge bunch of accomplishments to really talk about too much as he's running for re-election in the election of 1976. So the election of 1976 rolls around, and challenging President Ford is Jimmy Carter, a new kind of politician, as he proclaims, and becomes a new, different kind of president, something we really hadn't seen before in a lot of ways in Jimmy Carter, who runs and successfully wins the election of 1976 as a Democrat. Jimmy Carter, first of all, had no experience in national politics, and he had not been in politics most of his life at all anyway. He was a peanut farmer from Georgia, and then got elected governor of Georgia, and then gets elected president in 1976. And he runs on this platform of, he's an outsider, I'm different, I'm not like the rest of Washington. And keep in mind, people still have a really sour taste in their mouth about politicians, about the Washington establishment, about all of that after the Watergate scandal. And so Carter really tries to capitalize on the fact that he doesn't have anything to do with that he's never been in national politics before. All the people that he's going to appoint, all of his staff, all of those folks have never been a part of that Washington insider crowd before. And so they're honest, and they're going to be different, and they're going to do the right thing. They really run on that he's an honest guy. He's going to do the right thing, not necessarily the partisan thing, not what his party wants him to do or that kind of stuff, but what is truly the right thing to do. Kind of takes a high road kind of a thing. And in reality, Carter really does try to do that. But as we're going to see, oftentimes doing the right thing isn't always the popular thing, and also not always the effective thing. It might be the taking the moral high ground, but not necessarily what yields results. And of course, that's what the American public oftentimes wants to see, is those results. So Carter wins in 1976. And the former governor of Georgia becomes the next president. And he is a Democrat, like I said, but he also kind of represents, or tries to represent, a more moderate wing of the Democratic Party. They're trying to separate themselves from what they looked at as kind of a runaway liberalism of the Democratic Party. Unlike New Dealer Democrats, unlike Great Society Democrats, Carter does not want to just throw a bunch of new government programs at the problem the way that, say, Johnson did with the Great Society, or Franklin D. Roosevelt had done with the New Deal. A lot of new proposals, new laws, new programs, the government getting bigger, more government spending. That's not what Carter wants to do. So it's less defined. And that becomes one of the big problems with Carter's policies and Carter's leadership, is that he doesn't have like any kind of clear goal of what he wanted to do. He has no, clear plan or objective. It's very, very sporadic as far as what he tries to do. But let's take a look at some of the big crises domestically, and then some of the things in foreign policy that Carter deals with or attempts to deal with, and look at those results. And cue the light, just like before. Hold on just a second. There it is. Now they remember that I'm here. Anyway, so the big problem that plagues the country still is an energy crisis. And we talked about this actually with Nixon, with the OPEC embargo, and that created the oil shortage and the gas shortage, and oil prices, gas prices were going up. Now, that embargo actually ended in 1974, but even with that embargo ending, first of all, it would take a while for oil reserves, gas reserves, all those things to be built back up, to pre-embargo levels. But it's not just that. There's just a growing understanding and a growing fear in the United States that the United States was far too dependent on foreign energy sources and far too dependent on foreign oil. And so there were great concerns, not just about the shortages of gasoline but shortages of electricity, and how are we going to meet our energy needs in a way that's not going to make us vulnerable in the world. And Carter, he tried to deal with the energy crisis in some voluntary kind of ways. Again, he didn't want to attack it with a whole lot of laws and programs, although there is some of that. One of the ways that Carter responds to the energy crisis, and because this for Carter, you have to realize it's not like a quick fix kind of a thing. This is something that it's not, one law is not going to fix this, one program's not going to fix this. This is about changing people's behavior. It's about changing the way that we approach energy to make sure that we break our dependency on foreign oil and start utilizing things that are going to be more sustainable in the long run. So that's not something that one law or one program is going to do. So one kind of overreaching program, well, not even a program, but method to try to look at the way that the United States consumes energy and to try to make things better was the creation of a new cabinet office, the Department of Energy, to oversee any kind of laws or policies or rules or regulations regarding energy usage that may come up. And from this, you will also get laws about or programs and initiatives to decrease the use of fossil fuels in the United States. Fossil fuels are those that come from like gasoline, so more electric power, more solar power. But Carter also tries to emphasize a lot of personal changes, encouraging people to stop using so much energy, like this little sticker or this poster above my head here, encouraging people to not drive so much, take carpools, turn off the lights when you're not in the room. Don't use your air conditioner so much in the summertime. Open up your windows. Don't use your heater in the wintertime. Put on a sweater or a coat or something so that in the house, so that you're not utilizing all of that. So encouraging Americans to try to voluntarily save and be more frugal in their energy usage and all that kind of stuff. Things that people oftentimes don't like to hear. Just like now, in the 1970s, people enjoyed their air conditioning and their heating, and they liked driving places and going shopping and all that kind of stuff. So to tell people, hey, we need to be more frugal and be more conservative, saying that to a people that have pretty much had everything they wanted, for the past couple of decades, of in this age of consumerism and, get what you want kind of a thing, that really wasn't very, very popular. So again, it doesn't, while it does lay some groundwork for some better energy policy, and we will start to see some changes with more fuel efficient cars being built, regulations about fuel efficiency in cars, switching to unleaded gasoline. Carter kind of ahead of his time in a lot of ways too. Carter actually had solar panels installed on the White House, which seemed nuts to people at the time. Nowadays, that wouldn't be quite so nuts at all. In fact, Carter's successor, Ronald Reagan, had those solar panels removed, but those are some things that wouldn't really be crazy now. So some of the more green kind of initiatives that we might expect to see today, Carter tried to encourage some of those things. But the energy crisis, it doesn't really help Carter's popularity that the problems do persist, but also because Carter was urging people that the solution isn't us doing less and not getting as much as what we want. That wasn't very popular amongst a lot of people. A big thing for Carter was, oh, and by the way, if you're interested, Carter is the first president we've talked about at all that is still alive. He is 90, I want to say he's about 96, lives not too far from here in Plains, Georgia, and still working every day on certain things, particularly in this regard. Carter was and is very much a deeply religiously convicted person, a Southern Baptist, taught Southern Sunday school, still did up until just a few years ago, or until the recent health crisis forced him to stop teaching Sunday school every couple of weeks. And he continued to do that actually during his presidency. But anyway, one of his big kind of personal things, and one of the things that he wanted to incorporate into the United States' sort of overall policy, was his commitment to human rights. And he had this very idealistic vision, kind of similar to Woodrow Wilson in a way, that the United States needed to stand up for and defend human rights throughout the world. And so he works this into his approach to foreign policy and his approach to foreign nations. And so this meant, cutting off aid and cutting off supplies to countries that had a history of human rights violations, taking that kind of time to take that sort of high road, that moral road, and all of that, which was sometimes not very popular. It also has some other consequences. That human rights stance and this stance in favor of strong support for human rights has an effect on the United States' relationship with the Soviet Union. And effectively, it pretty much ends detente. Not to say that they just suddenly announce an end to detente, but it definitely puts more tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union, being a totalitarian dictatorship type country that suppresses free speech and suppresses opposition, well, those are things the United States would consider to be violations of human rights. So the United States taking this hard line, supporting human rights, kind of alienates the Soviet Union and causes some tension between the two. And we will also see another way in which that relationship is further damaged a little bit during the late 1970s. Another piece of the puzzle here, another way in which the Cold War continues, and actually those Cold War tensions are heightened a little bit, where there was kind of some hope that things were about to get better, but where tensions actually become even more heightened, was with the SALT II treaty, or the attempt at what became known as SALT II. You may remember SALT I. Remember, SALT stood for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. These were your first nuclear weapons treaties between the United States and the Soviet Union to try to de-escalate the nuclear arms race and to try to deal with that whole problem. The first one, if you remember, just said no atmospheric testing. SALT II was going to actually put limitations on the number of missiles and the number of nuclear warheads and the number of missile systems and weapons delivery systems that both the United States and the Soviet Union could actually have. So this one was going to take it a step further. But SALT II actually gets shelved. It gets thrown out the window. It is halted over Soviet violations of human rights because of that stance the United States was taking. And Carter was trying to be a real high ground, moralistic, idealistic kind of president to say, we're not even going to negotiate with you on this if you're going to do A, B, and C. So again, that stance on human rights, while it is incredibly admirable, in some ways, it also leads to further tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the SALT II treaty is sort of thrown out the window. The Senate never ratifies it, and that whole thing breaks down. The United States' relationship with the Soviet Union was further complicated, and things went further, made more difficult for President Carter when the Soviet Union in 1980 invaded Afghanistan, beginning what becomes known as the Soviet-Afghan War. Think of the Soviet-Afghan War as very much like the United States' Vietnam. And this is oftentimes referred to as kind of the Soviet Union's Vietnam. They went into Afghanistan to prop up a communist government there that was falling apart or that was threatened by rebels. And they end up in this quagmire of a war that they struggle to get out of, very much the same way that the United States struggled to get out of Vietnam, something that eventually became unwinnable for them. But the point is, more than you need to know that, is that the United States' response to the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan, because, Carter saw that as another violation of human rights. You can't go in and start invading Afghanistan and telling them what to do and trying to spread communism there and all that kind of stuff. So for one thing, the United States sent aid and support to, and I'm not going to go into the name and what they were called because you don't really necessarily need to know that, but sent aid and support to the Afghan rebels, I guess you could say, fighting against the Soviet Union. And that is actually what ends up becoming the Taliban later on. You're probably familiar with the Taliban and where Al-Qaeda was organized and where the 9/11 attacks were organized and all that kind of stuff. That was in Afghanistan, actually by a government that the United States kind of helped put in place originally as a means of keeping the Soviets, or trying to keep the Soviets out of Afghanistan. But also because of the human rights violations and because of the Soviet action in Afghanistan, another way that President Carter tries to show displeasure about that and tries to punish the Soviet Union for that is he orders the United States to boycott the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. So the 1980 Olympics are being held in Moscow, which is in the Soviet Union. And Carter said the United States is not going to participate and encouraged other countries of the world to do so as well. And a few others did, but most did not. And as you can imagine, that was not very popular in the United States. You know how Americans, we love the Olympics. And that's really a time where Americans kind of love to show off and have a lot of athletic success. And so the fact that the United States did not participate in the 1980 Moscow Olympics was another thing that made President Carter rather unpopular, and people were getting kind of frustrated and annoyed in some ways with his kind of moral high ground and trying to take the high road kind of stance on a lot of things. Probably, though, one of the bigger crises, and I think a lot of historians might argue this is one of the things that maybe contributes to President Carter's defeat in the election of 1980 more than anything else, is the Iranian hostage crisis from 1979 through 1980. If you remember, and we only mentioned this briefly, back in the 1950s, the United States had supported a CIA overthrow of the Iranian government and had put in place and supported until then, up until this point, until 1979, the Shah of Iran. So this is kind of the backstory. So the Shah of Iran had been put in place in Iran as kind of like the king of Iran in the 1950s. And this was a pro-American, pro-democracy. Well, Shah of Iran was not a democratic leader. He was quite a dictator. Very much a totalitarian ruler, but pro-American and pro-Western influence and all of those things. So the Shah of Iran has been supported by the United States for several decades in Iran. Well, in 1979, there was an overthrow of the Shah of Iran, and a Muslim fundamentalists, so like radical Islamic fundamentalists, took over Iran, and the new leader was taken over by a guy named Ayatollah Khomeini. So they overthrow the Shah, and they take over and lead this, again, radical fundamentalist Muslim or Islamic revolution and establish a fundamentalist, religiously based Islamic government in Iran that, really held deeply to very fundamental orthodox, sorry, I get the word out, orthodox Islamic values that the Shah of Iran had tried to replace. And this was a very, very, very anti-American government. This whole group hated the United States. As you can see these pictures here, you see them burning the American flag, blamed the United States for Iran, everything that they didn't like about Iran, saw the United States as controlling Iran. They wanted to put the Shah up, and Shah did all these terrible things, and wanted to hold not only the Shah responsible, but the United States responsible. And so they storm the American embassy and they take hostages. And so that is the hostage crisis. So there were 52, I think. 52 American hostages that were being held in captivity in Tehran. These were all like American diplomats and Americans who worked in the embassy. And when the embassy was stormed by these Islamic fundamentalists, they took these people prisoner and were demanding that the United States return the Shah of Iran to them, because the Shah of Iran happened to be in the United States. President Carter had allowed him into the United States to receive cancer treatment when all of this happened. And so they were saying, return the Shah to us, because they wanted to execute him, try him, and then execute him. And we will return your hostages and all of that. But Carter's response was, we don't negotiate with terrorists. You've heard that phrase before. That's kind of where that comes from. Carter says, this is a terrorist organization. This is not a legitimate thing. And we're not going to negotiate with terrorists, because that would give them the upper hand. That would make the United States look weak. That would make it look like, anywhere, any government could just threaten and take hostages and, do all that kind of stuff. And the United States would give in. So Carter has no intention of returning the Shah of Iran or giving into their demands, and instead tries to find other ways to free the hostages. And people are this is on the news every single night. It's a big drama that plays out for well over a year, this Iranian hostage crisis. And people are seeing images like this one. This is one of the American hostages. You can see they've got him handcuffed and blindfolded. And so every night on TV, they're parading these hostages out, putting them on television and mocking them and burning American flags. And you can imagine what that does for American public opinion that now look to Carter to do something about this. A lot of Americans wanted a military response, but Carter wasn't willing to go all in with that just yet. He appeals for help from the United Nations, but nothing ever happens with that. Eventually, in 1980, there was an attempt to rescue them, covert military operation to try to rescue them that ended in a total disaster, and they never even made it to Tehran, and several American servicemen were killed in that operation, and it was a big embarrassment. So they were unable to negotiate an end to this until the end of the Iranian hostage crisis comes actually on the day that Carter leaves office. On the day that Ronald Reagan is inaugurated, these hostages would be released after 444 days in captivity. So well over a year, these 52 people were kept in captivity and held hostage by this Iranian government. They agreed to release the hostages once Jimmy Carter was no longer in office, and they also essentially the United States kind of paid ransom for them. They had frozen Iranian assets in the United States, and they agreed to unfreeze those assets, and they could have access to those funds again. So the Iranian hostage crisis and Carter's seeming inability to deal with it and seeming inability to bring about an end to it, among other shortcomings, result in Carter becoming incredibly unpopular, seemed a very ineffective, and ultimately leads to his defeat in 1980 by Ronald Reagan. So as far as some of the overall shortcomings for the Carter administration, and another kind of common assessment for Carter, a lot like Ford, is that he truly was and is a very kind, decent, truly honest person, but just may not have been well cut out for the presidency and kind of in over their head. And a lot of things that they thought they could do really well, turns out they're quite naive. It's so easy for a lot of us to look here and say, well, I could do that job, or I'm not going to do this, or I'm not going to do that. But there's kind of a reason sometimes why people do it that way. And so the inexperience is a problem. That was one of the things that Carter really used to his advantage to get elected, to say, I'm an outsider, I'm different, I'm not like everybody else, I don't have any experience in Washington, I'm not part of that insider crowd. And he's going to surround himself with people that are not part of that insider crowd. But that turns out to be one of the weaknesses, because they didn't understand how things worked. While there's something to be said for someone being fresh faced and someone not being tainted by Washington, there's also something to be said for people that have experience in how things work in Washington. And because they did not have any of that, a lot of stuff just didn't get done, and they were very ineffective. And they came across, and Carter often came across, as quite arrogant, as, I'm going to do it my way, not the way you want me to do it. And oftentimes that meant things just simply didn't get done. Carter, as I mentioned earlier, particularly in regard to domestic policy, never really had a clear vision, a clear goal of what it was he wanted to do. He tried to do a lot of things kind of too quickly. He was very much a micromanager, kind of try to do everything himself, as opposed to delegating tasks to other people. Kind of got obsessed and bogged down in a lot of details. So again, a lot of things just didn't get done. And instead of making progress, they just kind of got bogged down in a lot of minuscule kind of stuff. And overall, Carter just failed to galvanize a lot of support for a lot of things that he wanted, like energy conservation. He just kind of said what may have been the honest answer, but might not have been the answer people wanted to hear. And he sometimes came across, like I said, as arrogant, as being sort of overly moralistic, as being depressing. So he had a tendency to sometimes kind of sort of preach to people, kind of being kind of the downer a lot of the time, and kind of lost that optimism. He was just didn't have the kind of charm that a lot of people sort of wanted to see. So in the meantime, Republicans are planning their strategy and their plan for 1980, and we will see the election of Ronald Reagan next time, beginning of the next unit.